Today we're going to cover 2.1, Introduction to Biodiversity. I wanted to start this one off with a nice quote. Biodiversity is the greatest treasure we have. Its diminishment is to be prevented at all costs. So I want to get you thinking about how important biodiversity is to our ecosystems and to the biomes and the populations that we're going to be discussing. Again, our big idea is there are interactions between Earth systems, and we're going to look at how all these things come together to give us biodiversity. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the levels of biodiversity and their importance to ecosystems. To accomplish this goal, we will identify the levels of biodiversity, explain the importance of biodiversity, describe the differences between specialists and generalist species, and describe what species richness is. So, what is biodiversity? We define this as the variety of the life on Earth. Currently, we estimate that there may be around 8.7 million species, but only 2 million of those have been described, so there could be significantly more than that. I found this graphic really interesting that US homes harbor more than 500 species of insects and their relatives, and I feel like in the last few days I've met most of them. So I mentioned that there's levels of biodiversity. So we've been throwing this word around there, but we haven't really identified what it means. So we're going to start with genetic biodiversity. So what does it mean on a genetic level? So genetic diversity is that variation in genes among individuals and in a population. So in humans, we know that people have different blood types. That's genetic variation. Perhaps you've heard of Darwin's finches and the genetic variation in their beaks. And as someone with an animal science degree, when I think of genetic diversity, I think of the diversity in all the livestock. Particularly, I used to work with sheep, so we have lots of different diversity in our different breeds of sheep. So why is genetic diversity important? How does this allow us to have biodiversity? If you've ever looked or talked about the rock pocket mouse, they come in two colors. We have a tan mouse and a black mouse. And these guys are found in Arizona and New Mexico in an area that's prone to having different colored rocks. So they may have the tan rocks, they may have black rocks. So why is this important? Because if you are a tan mouse over here, let's get a pen. If you're this tan mouse on the black background, you are super easy to spot, especially by a predator with a really good quality eyesight. Versus this guy, much harder to find. And then the same mouse, if you were to drop him on a lighter colored rock, not a good day for him. And then our lighter mouse over here, hard to spot. So the more diversity in your population, the better it can respond to environmental stressors. So if this population was only these tan mice, and suddenly there was a volcanic explosion and everything was covered by a black ash, their entire population is going to be wiped out pretty quickly because they're so easy to see. But because there's variation, it allows their population to continue. So we often think about this in terms of a population bottleneck. So you have your original population, you see all these different colors, so all these different varieties of genes. But then we get some sort of bottleneck event. It could be a natural disaster, it could be even caused from people, it could be completely random, such as the continents drifting apart. That's your bottleneck because now you're all separated. And maybe all of the genes don't make it. And your surviving population has a much different array of genetics than your original population. And these are the only ones that are going to populate our new group. So this decreases our population size. So right here we have a decrease in population size. And it also decreases genetic diversity. Particularly if there was a favorable gene to have in the bottleneck event, that's what's going to make it. Those unfavorable ones will not. So it overall decreases genetic diversity. As I said, people often have a hand in this. So again, going back to my animal science roots, we've got the population structure and diversity in horses. And then when we started selecting and breeding them, we only have basically this one genetic line left with very few other lines of horses. With dogs, inbreeding leads to an increase in harmful mutations and a decrease in genetic diversity, so they suffer more elbow problems. So another level of biodiversity is at the species level. So the number and variety of species in a particular ecosystem. So if you remember, we talked about how tropical areas, the tropical rainforest has the highest biodiversity of terrestrial biomes. And you can see here the number of bird species in some areas is up over 600, while up here where we live, it's significantly lower. And that holds true for the number of mammal species here too. So we call this species richness. This is going to come up a lot. It's the number of different species in an area. So if we've got two plots of land, and plot A has 24 species of plants and plot B has 84 species of plants, plot B has a higher species richness simply because of the diversity in the number. So here's another example. Community 1 and Community 2. You can see the different species that they have. Both species have the same species richness here. So they each have 4 different species. But they have different numbers of individuals for each species. So which one of these has greater biodiversity? I'll let you think about that for a second. All right, and hopefully you came up with community number 1, which has greater biodiversity than community 2 because while community 2 has the same 4 species, it's mostly dominated by species A. It doesn't really have a diversity in those other species. Now, species diversity is important because ecosystems with a greater number of species have greater resilience. If there was to be a blight that wipes out oak trees, but there's other species of trees in the area, it's not going to completely wipe out the forest. Okay, so in this example, community A, we have a couple different species of birds and also the same species richness in community B. They have different numbers of individuals for each species. So which one do you think has a greater biodiversity? All right, we're going to go with community B here. Again, this one is mostly made up of those small birds, only one of the others. So in addition to genetic and species diversity, we also have habitat and ecosystem diversity. So within a certain area, you can have tons of different habitats. So an area with a large number of different habitats is more likely to recover from disruptions because they lead to greater species diversity, they have greater genetic variation. A good one here is the Columbia River Basin. So Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and you can see there's the list of all the different habitats you can find. It's quite diverse. Here's a different kind of map showing the different regions in Connecticut. We're not as large of an area. So within different habitats, we have organisms that have developed different strategies. They have different habits. So we have specialists. They live in only one habitat, they eat one or a few types of food, and they can tolerate a limited range of environmental conditions. So it could be a limited range of temperatures or sunlight, any one of those abiotic factors. On the other hand, we have generalists. They can live in a broad range of areas, they can adapt to many environments, they eat a wide range of food, and they can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. So specialists are very successful when there's stability in their environment. So they are very well suited to the area that they're in, and they do quite well. But they do not do well when there's disruption. So 2 examples, we've got the panda versus the raccoon, who has different niches. The panda is our specialist, can only live in a certain area, eats certain foods, whereas this guy over here is a generalist and can withstand a lot of change. So habitat loss is a particular problem for our specialist species. So the specialists are at a risk for extinction, whereas our generalists, such as this guy, adapts really well to urban living. He's doing just fine. So to summarize, our goal was to explain levels of biodiversity and their importance to ecosystems. Biodiversity has 3 levels. We talked about the genetic, the species, and the habitat diversity. And the big takeaway here is that areas with greater biodiversity are more resilient when faced with disruptions. So one of my favorite fish is, cichlids, and they're found in Lake Malawi, and there's upwards of 2,000 to as many as 5,000 different species, and that's me being a Lake Malawi cichlid when I worked at the aquarium.